Thanks, Brad. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So I'd like to tell you how it actually came that Brad invited me to be here. So imagine this. This is some months ago. Brad says, Portia, would you like to come and preach at our church one day? I'm like, oh, gosh, yes, I'd love to come. Man, that would be awesome. Sure, please set that up for me, Brad. All right, we'll make that happen. Brad comes back a little bit later and says, I actually have an open date. I actually have an open date, Brad says. And I say, oh, okay, yeah, I'm free that day. Man, I would love to come. This would just be really great. So Brad says, okay, we'll confirm. I'll email you the text and we can get going. I'm like, oh, this is so great. So a little bit later, he emails me the text. I'm sitting at my desk at work. When I open up the email, I'm like, oh, look, it's Sermon on the Mount. This is great. I click on Bible Hub so that I can read the text while I'm sitting right there at my desk. I read the text. I read the text. I read the text. And I go, oh, I'm toast. And you will see why when I share with you what the text is that we are working on today. So let's look at the passage. Jesus said, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of the pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commandments and teaches them accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness, this is you all, church, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter into the kingdom of heaven. So sometimes I will have to admit, Jesus is hard for me to understand. And even worse, sometimes when I think I understand him, I don't actually like what I think he's saying. And this is a passage that I've had to struggle to understand. And I believe I have come to like what Jesus is saying here, but I have to read this a little differently in order for that to happen. So before we dive into sort of how I read this, let's look at the context just a little bit. So we had the Beatitudes before, and Brad, I understand, spoke on those. Perhaps for the Beatitudes, we could just sort of sum up, reality is different than you think it is, and reality is even different than your experience of what you think reality is. And then we had salt and light, and maybe that's saying you're different too, so live out what it is to be different. Our passage might be, and the difference is not what you think it is. And then after this, I'm sure you'll be hearing a whole series of sermons on You Have Heard It Said, and this is going to be ways that Jesus is telling us, here's some examples of what it's like to live out what I will call a new reality. So the way that I really want to frame my understanding of this passage is that Jesus is speaking not of the reality that was understood by his audience, or maybe even the reality that is always understood by us, but that Jesus is speaking this truth into a new reality, into a way that the world is different than people had thought that it was. And it's been hard for me in my journey to get to the place where I can hear things from the new reality. I didn't grow up in a Christian home, but when I became a Christian in my late teens, I went to a pretty rigid, fundamentalist, even maybe borderline legalistic church. And so my original context with hearing Scripture was from this orientation. And so when I hear something like, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees, forget it, I could only hear, wow, I'm really in trouble, because those guys were righteous, and I can't do that. So what is there left for me? And I would understand that there is grace. I would understand that Jesus forgives, and I would understand that part of my need for righteousness is what enables grace to work in my life. And I would get that. but I was still in my mind sort of separating out, this is what righteousness looks like. You can't manage it. Here is what grace looks like. Doggone it, you are absolutely reliant on that. And there is truth in that, but I don't think that that's the final truth of how we might read a passage like this. So let me talk a little bit about what is the old reality in my way of looking at this. So we're wired to be pretty binary creatures. To begin with, we live and then we die. That's just a truth of being human being. Pretty darn binary. You're either alive or you're dead. We see things in black and white, and I use that very advisedly because a number of years ago, I had an African American friend remind me, when you say that we see things in black and white, do you realize what you're saying? You're saying white's good and black is bad, and you need to be very careful with that. So I advisedly put that up there with that understanding that even talking about, well, I don't want to see things in black and white, I want to see things in shades of gray, even that can be a way of making the world a black and white world in the way that we do not want it to be. We tend to think about those who are righteous versus those who are sinners. We tend to think in right and wrong, friends and enemies. You're either my friend or you're my enemy. In sense of us and them. We're in us. We're the church. We trust one another. We love one another. We believe one another. But there is a dangerous, hungry world waiting out there when we leave these doors. And we might be inclined to see people outside that as them, those who are threats to us. This is simply the way that we are wired to think about the world. My sense, however, is that this is what Jesus came to change. He came to change us from being binary creatures into being something else, something that transcends the binary. Look at live and die. Live and die doesn't mean what it meant before Jesus came. It used to mean you lived and then you died. And that's the way that it was meant to be. After Jesus came and did what he did, life and death no longer have that meaning. We're dead, then we learn to live, and then we go on to a life in heaven. There's not two things anymore. So one of the things that Jesus did is kind of mixing up the binaries. So my original learned sense of what this passage might have been is what makes this passage seem so harsh to me. So I'm going to give you Portia's old reality binary paraphrase. This is how I would have heard this passage for probably a significant part of my Christian life. You think that because I've come to bring grace, that you don't have to worry about following the rules anymore. Wrong. In fact, I've come to be even stricter about the rules. Every single law ever invented is in place, and if you break any of the rules God made or encourage others to do the same, you are a very bad person. Very, very bad person. In fact, you can't be even more perfect. If you can't be even more perfect than the Pharisees, who are really good at being good, then don't even bother. And to be clear, yes, your salvation does rest on being just that perfect. Whew. So you can see why when I got this passage from Brad, I was like, maybe I can't make it that week after all. But I do know that I have a new transformed way of understanding this passage, just as I have a transforming way of regarding who Jesus is and of hearing his words and hearing his work in my life. And I hope I continue to have a transforming sense of that for as long as I live. So I needed to find a new way to understand what Jesus was saying here. So put this in terms of a new reality. Jesus is mixing up those categories, those binary things, and he's messing them up all over the place until they don't work in the fashion that he set them out. So if I want to re-paraphrase sort of where we are in the sense of the Sermon on the Mount, you might hear the Beatitudes to say, you think you know what will make you happy, but it won't. And you think you know what will prevent you from being unhappy? Sometimes that is the thing that will make you the happiest. He's taking what we understand and saying, no, it's exactly different than you think it is. And then our passage, you think you know how to be good? You don't. And we'll talk about that. And then after this, as you go into the next weeks, you think you know who is good and who is bad and who is in and who is out. Well, you don't. And I wish I could come back and listen to Brad talk about that for a while, because I think I would learn a lot from it. So let's look again at our passage from a new reality standpoint, and let's see what happens here. Okay, so Jesus said, I come not to abolish, but to fulfill. Now, again, my early understanding would have made me want to say, excuse me, Jesus, I thought you did come to abolish the law. I thought you came to tell me that the law only makes me understand myself as a sinner, and I thought you came to abolish it with grace. Jesus is saying here, no, that's not right. If that's what you understood, that's not right. I did not come to abolish the law. Instead, I came to fulfill the law. So it's important for me to understand what the law and the prophets are. Does this mean every jot and tittle of the Old Testament purity codes? Or does it mean something maybe, again, a little different than that? Would that be a very binary way of looking at it, that all of these rules that are made, that the nation of Israel had to hold, that that's what the law is? Or is there actually something a little different that Jesus is trying to communicate that the law and the prophets are? So Jesus, fortunately, also says a little bit later in the book of Matthew, he does actually come back and give us some reflection about what the law and the prophets really are in this new reality. The greatest commandment, he was asked, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then, at least in Matthew's telling, he doesn't just leave it there. He goes on to say, all the law and the prophets hang on those two commandments. All of the law and the prophets hang on those two commandments. So here, in the Sermon on the Mount, when I hear Jesus talking about the law and the prophets, I have to reorient my thinking not to the reality that his audience would have heard, like, oh my gosh, there are so many laws. There are all these purity codes. It's really hard. Even the Pharisees don't get it right. How can I possibly do this? I have to reorient myself from that sense of the law and the prophets into this new reality of the law and the prophets. Look, there are really two commandments, and every other commandment springs from these commandments. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. And I have had to rehear what Jesus has said through that orientation. I am a seminarian, which may be why Brad asked me to come. So here I am. I'm almost a second-year seminarian. And so I can easily cope with something as actually exegetically difficult as this, right? And last fall, I took an Old Testament class. And I've obviously read the Old Testament. I've obviously taken classes in the Old Testament before. But the professor in this class gave us a new orientation toward the Old Testament. He did not give us what is often called a Christological reading of the Old Testament, which is pretty common, where you read the Old Testament through the New Testament. Instead, he made us read it as the Hebrew Bible. He said, forget everything you know about Christianity and read the Old Testament like the audience of the various books of the Old Testament would have read it. And then he encouraged us to look for over and over and over again what the writers of the Old Testament say about what it means to really live a righteous life. And all of a sudden, a lot of things that had never popped up to me in reading the Old Testament, all of a sudden were highlighted. You were strangers and aliens once. Welcome the strangers and aliens into your land. When the prophets are castigating the nations of Israel and Judah, they aren't yelling at the common people who are doing everything that they can to try and live a good life. They're yelling at the rulers, and they're saying to the rulers, you are oppressing your own people. You are not letting my heart and my work be done in their lives, and you will be removed if you continue to do that. That's a lot different than you're all sinners and I'm removing my grace from you. That's a lot different. It's saying there is a way to live, and it's very important. But it's not about being rigid and judgmental to other people. It's about offering love for the most vulnerable, for the stranger, for the dispossessed, and learning to live that out. In fact, my way of reading the Old Testament sounds a lot like Jesus' summation of the Old Testament. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. If you are not doing those, then everything else is just details. One of the problems that I see in our culture, and quite frankly, it's in our Christian culture, maybe worse than it is anywhere else in our culture, is that we have separated those two things. We somehow have come to think that loving the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and spirit means that we have to harshly judge and fear and punish our enemies. Right? Isn't that some of the rhetoric you hear around things? We know how to be good. We do. We have rules. We have laws. We know what it is to be a good person. Those people are not being good people. They are other. They are outsider. We cannot be tainted by them. We cannot be polluted by them. We must teach them how to be good people like us, right? You hear this in our Christian culture all the time. To me, that's separating out these two commandments. Love the Lord your God. Yes, value truth. Know what is right. Seek it. Do the right thing. But you cannot do that if you do not love your neighbor. You cannot love God if you don't love your neighbor. And so if we're going to say that loving God means speaking the truth even if it hurts other people, and loving my neighbor means that, like, I'll bring a really good casserole to church, which I believe some people did today. If that's what we're going to hear, we are not hearing what Jesus said. He said, loving the Lord your God and loving your neighbor are the same thing. They are two sides of the same coin. If you do not love your neighbor, then you are not loving God. So he also says elsewhere that loving your neighbor means loving your enemy. So if we want to read our neighbor as the one who is close to us, the one who is sitting near us, the one who is very like us in a lot of ways, the one who is safe for us, if we want to read that person as being our neighbor, then we're making a giant mistake. Jesus said, your enemy is your neighbor, the one who threatens you, the one who is dangerous to you, the one who does want to destroy your world and your lifestyle is your enemy. Love them. And this is the law and the prophets. So when I reread the passage that we have today, I didn't come to abolish, but to fulfill. What I hear Jesus saying is, you guys have been abolishing this because you've made the purity codes, the little teeny tiny things about how often you wash your hands. You've made that be the whole truth here. I am abolishing that way of seeing the law and the prophets. What I am fulfilling is love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. And this is the thing that I am coming to fulfill. And my whole life and my death and my resurrection is all about this. And that is what I hear Jesus saying in this passage. So if we try to fulfill the first commandment by breaking the second commandment, we're making a huge mistake. We must not read Jesus' words as promoting fear or hatred or othering of other people. So then the passage goes on to say that not a single bit of this law and prophets will disappear until everything is accomplished. And there is a big question as to what does it mean that everything is accomplished? What does it mean? And how do we know that everything has been accomplished? And I've heard teachings that said, well, Jesus' death on the cross accomplished this. It is finished. When he dies for our sins, this is accomplished, and we are going on to a new life. And I believe that there is truth in that, but I don't believe that's the whole way that we can regard this. Instead, I think that everything is accomplished really isn't happening in this side of heaven. I don't think that everything is accomplished. We still have work to do to try to accomplish everything, to try to live this out, but it really isn't done Paul says in Romans 8, we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved, but hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? And we have some awesome, wonderful things in this glorious world that God has given us. But it is not the end. Things are not yet finished. Things are not yet accomplished. And anybody who pays attention to what life is like knows that this is so, because life is hard. It hurts. Pain happens. If you love, you will suffer. You cannot love without suffering. And when Jesus tells us to love our neighbor, we are going to suffer from loving, because you cannot love and look at your neighbor in pain and not suffer. And so this is a hard thing that Jesus is asking us to do, to love our neighbor as ourselves, because it means we open up ourselves to the pain of the world. And so if Jesus is saying that somehow his work on the cross accomplishes this, and whew, awesome, we don't have to suffer anymore, we don't have any pain, we just get to live out lives being very, very, very happy people, I don't think that that's what he's saying. I think he is saying that this will come to an end, but you have to hope in what you do not yet see. You have to keep on hoping, and you have to do this hard work of loving God and loving your neighbor while you are getting to this point. So one of the things that this means is that we must keep our ideals. We have to hold these two truths in tension. We don't live in a perfect world, but we should live as though we do live in a perfect world. That's not easy, right? Because to live as though we live in a perfect world means that I am not going to punish others before they punish me. I understand, I never played football myself, but I understand that something that coaches will tell football players is go in hard so you don't get hurt. Go in hard. If you back off, if you're tentative, that's when it will hurt. You got to go in hard. You got to knock the other guy down first, and it's going to hurt less, even if that seems scary to you. We cannot live our lives like that. We cannot live going in hard so we don't get hurt. We cannot live flattening out and pushing away and punishing and trying to get rid of other people so that nothing hurts us, so that we protect ourselves. We can't do that. We also cannot live so frightened of the way that the world is going to hurt that we cocoon ourselves and entomb ourselves so that nothing is going to get in there and nothing is going to make us hurt. We cannot live in either one of those ways. Instead, we have to live in this new reality that Jesus gives us, that the world is not perfect, and yet we need to live as though the world is perfect. One of the scariest lines in Scripture for me is the line in the Lord's Prayer, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." I pray the Lord's Prayer every day. I'm an Episcopalian. We do that sort of thing. And when I get to that sentence in the Lord's Prayer, I have to take a breath every time I say that and ask myself, do I really mean this? Because do you know what I'm praying when I pray, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven"? I am saying, God, I want your will done on this earth. God, I want to align my will with your will. God, I want to do on earth as you would do on earth. And if that means that I have to live on earth as though I am living in heaven, I am doing probably the most terrifying thing I can imagine, right? In heaven, we don't have to be afraid of anything. There will be no suffering. There will be no fear. There will be no pain. We can simply run through the meadows of God, absolutely free as children of God, with no worry for anything. If I am going to live on earth as though I am in heaven, if I really want God's will done on earth, not just done in my way, but done as it is in heaven, then I have to live as a very vulnerable person. I have to be willing to do what is right, to reach out, to love, to connect, to not protect myself, to let myself be kin with those in the world, to not put my safety before everything else. I have to do that if I really want God's will done on earth as it is in heaven. That's the only response that I can have. I have to live on earth as though I'm in heaven. Now, I don't manage to do this very often. I just want to assure you, I can't live this out. But that has to be my ideal. I cannot let the ideal slide just because I can't live up to it. And this is another frustration in life, right? Isn't it easier to let your ideals slide than it is to be continually, moment by moment, frustrated by not living up to them? Fine, I just won't hold that ideal because it's painful to hold an ideal I can't live up to. And Jesus says, actually, that's part of the pain that you have to live in. You have to live in the pain of having an ideal that you can't live up to. And that is part of why you need my grace, not just once at a moment of salvation, but you need it every single breath of your entire life. You need God's grace because you can't live up to your ideals. But the right solution is not to let the ideals go. The right solution is to be willing to live on earth as though we are in heaven and to know that it's hard. So we have to move out of our own heads and out of our own hearts, out of our sense of wanting to protect ourselves, and we have to move into being empathetic with other people, even other people who are in pain that we can't really comprehend or that we can't really look at if we are going to do this thing that Jesus is asking us to. So the next section of this passage is Jesus says, if you break the commandments, you're least, and if you keep the commandments, you're greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So what is this saying? Well, it's saying that how we live does matter. We don't just get to forget all of those commands in the Old Testament. We don't just get to forget everything that went on. Now, I'm not saying that, oh my gosh, that ham in the casserole this morning was a sin because we're not to eat pork. I'm not saying that in any way. Those are the purity codes. Those were meant for a people in a time and a place in which it was really important to preserve their health. I'm not saying we go back to that. What I am saying is that this law and the prophet, love God, love our neighbor, is the essential part of what it means to live out who we are as human beings. That matters enormously. Grace covers it when we don't live up to it, but it does matter that we try to live up to it. And so just saying, well, I can't accomplish all of these things, so I'm not going to try to accomplish anything, I'll just watch TV, is not the right way to go through this. And there's nothing wrong with watching TV from time to time. I'm not legalistic about that at all. But how we live does matter. It makes a difference whether we're trying to do what Jesus tells us to or whether we're not trying. We don't get just to go, what, I can't do it, so I don't need to worry about it anyway. C.S. Lewis has a great quote in The Great Divorce. He is speaking to people that are deciding between heaven and hell. So they're not quite dead yet, but they're almost going to be dead. And they've got this chance to decide, do I want heaven? Am I willing to give up everything that I've held on earth that's keeping me from heaven in order to go into heaven, or am I just going to keep hanging on to these things and end up in hell? And he has one of the characters in this book tell the character who's in the process of making the decision. The character, the person who's deciding says, but what does it mean to have been in heaven or to have been in hell? And the teacher says, at the end of all things, when the sun rises here in heaven and the twilight turns to blackness there on earth, which will become hell, the blessed will say, we have never lived anywhere except in heaven. And the lost will say, we were always in hell. And both will speak truly. Part of what happens when we choose for heaven or choose for hell in this lifetime is it changes our life today and the lives of those around us. If we can get to the end of our journey on this earth and we can have walked faithfully with God, we will be able to look back and say, we were always in heaven. We were always in a wonder. Look at all that God did. Look at all He gave me. Look at the way my life was. Sure, there were hardships, but look at the miracles that God was doing every day in my life. On the other hand, if we refuse to see those things and think that way as we're going through life, when we get to the end of our life, we're going to look back and go, that was hard. Life was hard, there was pain, and there doesn't seem to be any purpose for all of that pain and suffering, and I am going to be bitter, and I'm going to be angry, and I'm going to be cynical, and I'm going to be hateful to other people because that's the way the world treated me. Our experience of ending up as one or the other of those types of people does not come from what happens to us. Bad things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people. That is not the difference. The difference is whether we have been walking toward and in heaven all the time and seeing the goodness that exists in the awful things, or whether we have not been doing that and we have only been seeing the darkness that is easily out there. That is what makes the difference. How we live does make a difference. So the end of this passage, that our righteousness must surpass the righteousness of the Pharisees, my response to this is still, and always has been, yikes. Okay, this is something I have to pay attention to. What does it mean that my righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees? This cannot be the righteousness that is in our actions, right? Because I just can't do that. Instead, it must be righteousness that is in my being, righteousness that is in the core part of me, the righteousness that comes from Christ's work on the cross and my acceptance of that work in my life. That is the righteousness that Jesus must be thinking about. The binary, you're sinner or you're righteous, is not what Jesus is saying here. He is saying in this new reality, you can be righteous. And it has nothing to do with you making mistakes and not being perfect. That has nothing to do with being righteous or not being righteous. Instead, if you can love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and spirit, and if you can love your neighbor as yourself, you have this righteousness in your being. And from other words of Jesus elsewhere, we also know that he is saying, and when you can't manage that, that's okay too. That's where I come in. I took care of that, and I will make sure that this works for you. So I have a few little takeaways here. Even if we're not going to succeed in this, we must not stop trying. So another of my colleagues at Jessup has what he calls the everlasting so what. He teaches English, Cameron Wilson, and he encourages the students when they're reading literature or when they're writing any kind of paper, pay attention to the everlasting so what, because you can write a beautiful paper about nothing, and it's just a beautiful paper about nothing. You can write a little bit jagged paper about something, and there's something there, and we'll smooth it out and make it beautiful, but you have to have your something. You have to have your everlasting so what, and I love that phrase. So I'm going to leave you with 3 everlasting so whats about what we've talked about. The first one is that we need to watch out for our binary tendencies. We need to watch out for othering people because it always ends badly. My youngest son is a student down at UC San Diego, and if you pay attention to the news, you'll know that a week ago today there was a shooting right near the UC San Diego campus. In fact, one of his best friends from childhood is living in the, actually 2 of his friends are living in the apartment complex where that shooting happened. It's right near the campus, and a lot of students live there. My son's friend's mother happens to be one of my best friends, and so I was processing this with her. This was terrifying for her to know that her son, he was upstairs in his apartment with his roommates when the shooting happened, and they heard something and thought maybe it was cherry bombs. They went to the window and looked out and realized, oh no, that's not cherry bombs. People were running and screaming, and there was blood, and there were bodies laying on the ground. That's what they saw outside the window of their dorm room. And in processing this with my friend Johniki, she said, maybe this is our new reality. Maybe people just shoot people. Maybe a random white guy shoots a bunch of random black people. Maybe a random black person shoots a bunch of random white people. Maybe that's our new reality. Maybe that's the reality that we're living in. And honestly, if we continue to other people, if we continue to make them our enemies, if we continue to say we're in, they're out, we're good, they're bad, we're safe, they're dangerous, then that will be our reality. We will end up in a binary world where everybody is trying to kill everybody else to keep themselves safe. So let's not do that in our hearts. Let's not do that in our lives. Let's not do that on a day-to-day basis. Instead, let's live with the openness and vulnerability we have, which is my second point. Keep your ideals, even when it's hard. Live on earth as though you were living in heaven. When you're inclined to be afraid and to flee, and in doing that, fleeing and being afraid, you're inclined to punish other people to keep yourself safe, resist the temptation to do that. Instead, take a breath and say, okay, life is dangerous. Life hurts. I am in one of the moments when things hurt. But I will not do back to those who hurt me what they have done to me, because then I am not living as though I were in heaven. In heaven, I won't have to do that. If I'm living on earth as though I'm living in heaven, then I don't have to punish back. Instead, I can say, wow, this hurts. I can say, this is wrong. I can say, you should not hurt me like this. I am not saying be a doormat and let other people abuse you. I am not saying that at all. Loving the Lord your God, who loves you as your child, as his child, does not permit you to just be a punching mat for other people. But we cannot say, before you hurt me, I'm going to hurt you. Before you touch me, I'm going to shove you. And we cannot say, even when you've hurt me, that's it. It's over for you. We cannot say that. We cannot do that. We have to live with our ideals, even if it's hard. And then finally, we need to be aware of what Jesus was aware of. In the Sermon on the Mount and other places, he cares for the dispossessed. He cares for the alien and the stranger. He cares for the one who is downtrodden. I heard Pastor Brad talk about the Gathering In program here. These are the least of these amongst us, but there are the least of these all over the world. And whether we actually actively do something about this particular problem here and now is far less important than the attitude that we have toward those who are needy and those who are dispossessed. When we hear and see these stories, are we going to say, wow, this hurts, I just am going to watch Netflix? Or are we going to say, wow, this hurts, and I can't do anything about this. I can't change this. I can't make it better, but I'm not going to not care just because I can't solve it. I am not going to be able to solve. I can't even solve the problems in my own life. How on earth am I going to solve the problems of the whole world? But I can't stop trying, and I can't stop caring just because I can't manage to do it. So when we see the stranger and the alien in our midst, we need to remember how Jesus feels about them and not just how we feel about them. So we want to change our ways of thinking from the binary and go into this new reality that Jesus has for us. So I'd like to invite you to stand. And I will pray for us. But as I do, be thinking about the empathy that God has for you. Be thinking about Jesus' work on the cross, how this really, in some ways, has been accomplished because of what Jesus has already done. Gracious God, we live in a frightening world. We live in a world full of pain, and we know that you are good, and we know that you are God. Help us to live in a non-binary new reality that keeps both of these truths before us. Make us as generous as you have been to us. Amen.